Hello, welcome. My name is Steve Zuiker. I'm a professor here at ASU, and I work with schools, with gardens, and with school garden support organizations to sustain and to deepen garden-based educational opportunities on campuses, um, both indoors and outdoors. I'm joined today by Dr. Perpetua Kirby, who's here in the US as a Fulbright scholar from the University of Sussex in, if I'm saying it correctly, Brighton, which I think is about an hour outside of London. As you may be able to see on your screen right now, I'm also joined by colleagues here in the Phoenix area, and they'll have a chance to introduce themselves after we've had a chance to hear from Dr. Kirby. Dr. Kirby is going to share her work on creating with uncertainty. And so I wanted to underscore as we get started and as you listen in that we all have had this experience of uncertainty, that gardens are, in fact, living laboratories of uncertainty. So we know they can be unpredictable. We know that plants fail. We know that weather shifts. We know that sometimes in March in Arizona, it hits 108 degrees, even though we might not be expecting that. So as you listen in, we invite you to think about how gardening on your campus also provides genuine opportunities to encounter complexity, to navigate ambiguity, and to deal with change. So gardens in this sense can also prepare students for a world shaped by uncertainty, including climate change, where uncertainty isn't something to be avoided, but to be navigated. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Perpetua Kirby to Arizona and to our talk today.
Thanks, Steve. That's great. Thank you very much for the introduction. And I'm really delighted to be here to be able to speak to you all today. I'm just going to share my slides and then I can get started. Can you see those? Yeah,
Yes.
great. So as Steve said, I'm from the University of Sussex on the south coast of the UK, directly below London. And today I'm going to talk about my work that I've done with schools in the area and further afield, and in my own teaching practice as well in the university. So I suppose my key underlying research interest is how do we educate for the 21st century, and in particular focusing on climate change and ecological degradation. What is it that we might do educationally that really engages with the complexities, the joys, the possibilities, and the fears that these challenges throw up? So what sort of teaching do we require across all ages and stages? And I've been particularly focusing in more and more on growing and food systems and how engaging with the students with those can really, what it might offer us educationally. In the last year, I've been researching my own teaching practice with higher education undergraduates in growing, and that will roll out into schools later on. But I'm going to talk about my work with schools on food systems more generally and growing in higher education. I think it's really important to stress embracing uncertainty. I do not know the answers. I work with many teachers who bring their expertise and knowledge of their particular context and what that might offer. And I'm really delighted to be here to find out more about what's going on in Arizona as well. So just to give a bit of background, I also teach at the university. I teach two forest food garden modules where they're broadly interdisciplinary modules and broadly sort of political ecology modules where we look at food systems in the round. We look at the sort of health, environmental, political, social dimensions of food systems, very much through growing a garden as well. So the sort of global to the local and the theoretical to the very practical. We have school students on site where our students work with them, and our students are actually tasked with designing educational resources for them that open up spaces of uncertainty as well. And it's a volunteer space from across the university campus and beyond, and a recreational space where students, for example, hold festivals. So that just give you a bit of background of what I'm doing on campus. So thinking about food systems, then this is a diagram that I've used with many different groups, and for me, it sort of encapsulates the complexities and sort of uncertainties of food systems. So the image on the right is the number of apples grown in the UK, and the small image to the left is the number of apples sold in supermarkets in the UK. And I was told this week by someone that's pretty similar in the US, that sort of difference there. So this sort of throws up a lot of things about what we don't know. For example, I have discussed this image with a whole load of people who are sort of food systems experts, and they were raising loads of things that we don't know. For example, the procurement practices of supermarkets. How do they decide what apples to buy? It's sort of pretty behind closed doors, those decisions. But it also raises lots of questions. For example, how many pollinators are there in the orchards on the left compared to the pollinators on the orchards on the right? And also, our response to this image is often as much emotional as it is sort of cognitive and intellectual. People express a lot of surprise, concern, sort of fear, but also hope in that sort of sense of that existing heritage, sort of apple heritage and diversity that exists. So I just want to sort of introduce that as sort of setting the scene for the uncertainties and complexities within the food systems and the sorts of activities that we've been engaging with students across different ages and including with teachers as well. As part of my work, I've been thinking with a colleague of mine, Rebecca Webb in the UK, about sort of models of education and where might uncertainty actually fit in to models of education. And we've borrowed a traveling metaphor from an anthropologist called Tim Ingold to really think this through. And the top left, is the sort of standard image of the teacher standing at the front and students in rows. And this is about learning as quickly and as efficiently as possible to a fixed destination. So we know where we want our students to go. We know what we want them to learn, and we share that knowledge. And it can be a really great way to teach. Equally, another way to get to the same destination as the plane is to take the train, where we might sit around in groups of four. We get up, we walk around, we talk, we might get off, we might do an experiment. It's a more scenic route, a slower route, but clearly we still want to reach the same destination as the plane. And those two are very much focused on learning. They're learning knowledge, learning skills such as critical thinking, knowledge about food systems, gardens, whatever it is that we're focused on. The third model we think of as seafaring. So this is where, as teachers, we get in the boat with the students, but we don't actually know where we're headed. We don't know what we're going to find. We don't know where we're going to go. We bring what we know with us. We might have a map, so we bring what we know, but ultimately it's inherently uncertain. And so this is where the emphasis is less on what is learned, but more on how we engage with the world in a way that might be transformative. So it's thinking about what do we do with what we've learned, and what does this require of us, and how might we change things. It requires the teacher to sort of keep students in the boat. It can be a difficult space to be. It's intellectually and emotionally quite challenging. And it's not that anything goes. It is really about staying with that difficulty and then seeing what this might interrupt, what it might sort of offer that's new, sort of challenging the status quo and offering new possibilities. So that's where we're sort of framing this idea of uncertainty with education as beyond learning. Learning is still really important, and all three of these models are really important with education. None is better than the other, but where might we make the space for the boat and where we get into the boat? I need to develop a different metaphor that's more around gardening, but for now we'll stick with the boat. So another educational theorist I draw a lot on is someone called Hert Biester, who's originally from the Netherlands. And he talks about world-centered education rather than about student-centered or teacher-centered. So this is where he really emphasizes the importance about encountering the world as outside ourselves. and where we draw the students' attention to the world. But it's not about students saying, what do I want from the world, but actually asking them to think, well, what might the world want from them? What is the world asking of them? And what is the call to them to do? Um, and here it's the call is to respond in a way that's sort of ethical, and not just functional and not just extractive. So he's really concerned with the possibility of students taking up that way of being an ethical, responsive subject in the world, someone who can stand up and change things. And he says the key educational question is whether what one desires is what one should desire in light of living one's life well with others and with the planet. And he says part of the problem we're in, the mess we're in on the planet, is because we've sort of projected so many of our desires onto it that it's not sustainable, whether, that's sort of lots of holidays, big cars, whatever it is. And actually we need to start questioning these desires. And he takes the Apple phone as an example. He says, Apple doesn't sell mobile phones. They sell the desire for a new phone. So students have got all these sort of desires being promoted, these forces on them that they have to navigate in the world. And he's saying that the teacher's role is really to support them to think through what that requires of them, but without assuming to know the answer. That actually the democratic endeavour in education is to support students to work that out. And he says that as a teacher, we need to keep students in that difficult middle ground where they're trying to work out what is required of them, and sort of navigate the internal forces, the feelings, the passions, the desires, and the external things that are being pushed onto them, such as through advertising. So I'm going to give you some examples in a minute of sort of how we might try and support students to stay in that difficult middle ground. And the first thing really is time, slowing time down to pay deep attention. And I think that's where gardens can be really, really valuable in creating that slow time. And if we were in a room together, I might give you all an apple. I'd ask you to cut it in half and really take some time to sort of experience that apple, sensorily, in terms of memories, what names it might evoke for you. And this would go really beyond the idea of just biology, ecology, nutrition, or even the history and heritages of apples. It's really about engaging philosophically with how we might attend to the world, in this case, the apple and agriculture. And attend to it in such a way that it's not about trying to master it or extract everything we can from the apple and the earth, but actually sort of thinking and taking the time to think about what this requires of us living on the planet. Now, I've done this exercise with many groups, and invariably people cut the apple this way, like on the screen, which is what we habitually do when we cut an apple to eat it and share it out. But the idea of creating with uncertainty is really to try and slow down and give students the possibility to attend to the world differently and to see what other possibilities might emerge. And to see whether, for example, we might cut the apple a different way and reveal something new and beautiful. So this is a sort of metaphor, if you like, for the possibilities of doing education slightly differently at times to allow something new to emerge. And the key questions of working with uncertainty in the classroom are really about encouraging students to think about what they see and imagine and feel, as well as what they think and what more they might need to know, but also drawing their attention to what might actually interrupt their expectations and their desires and what invites them to think and feel differently. And then what does that require of them? What does it demand of them? What is the call for them in terms of how they might respond ethically in the world, including what sort of support they might offer or need? So just to give some examples of staying in this middle difficult middle ground. It can be as simple as what we consume, which is inherently difficult, uncertain, and complex. Just choosing what milk to buy, there are multiple factors that we might consider. And each of us ultimately has to come to our own position on what kind of milk we want to buy. But it can help if we have the opportunity to deliberate the different factors and really sort of draw attention to those and focus on them and think through what that requires. Um, and then, of course, that's sort of a much smaller decision, but then there's farming as a whole. And as well as using deliberative practices, we use creative methods to really sort of support students to stay with the complexity of a big question, such as farming, which has become polarized by big debates about the economic and environmental sustainability concerns within farming, and a lot of conflict between farmers and other groups. And so we're trying to think, well, how can we bring these groups together? How can we sort of engage in this without that polarization, without that very critical voice? So we've piloted this game. It's developed by a colleague of mine, Joe Walton. We've piloted it with young people in schools, other contexts, and actually we're now piloting it with farmers and food systems people as well. And in essence, different groups create their own farms and they bid on things that they want in their farm with beans. And then life events happen by chance, so a flood or a drought, and that has impacts on their farms. And then what we tend to find is they start bartering with each other and even sort of developing a commons where, for example, a shared farm shop. So it's really interesting to see how they start playing with being a farmer through this serious play activity. Another way of staying in that difficult middle ground is, of course, the experiential activity of gardening and growing itself, and all the uncertainties, as Steve highlighted, in this process with the garden, but also working with each other to do it, addressing the multiple factors that need to be taken into account when creating a garden, and the different demands and resource possibilities. This is our forest food garden at the bottom image. This we created last week. It's a pond and a dead hedge surround, and it's going to be a sort of contemplative memorial space for a student. And this has been a long process. Last year's students were tasked with designing multi-species habitats. This year's students take on their designs, they implement them, and this year's students are now doing sustainable water solutions for the garden, and they will pass them on to next year's. So we have this sort of baton of passing on. I just want to sort of give an illustration of the sort of possibilities of this sort of ethical engagement with the growing. So this is from an essay of a student who talks about the module and being in the garden, working with the garden, and how it helped really pay them to pay attention to that which they'd often overlooked. So they describe it as the quiet labor of soil, the rhythms of growth and decay, and the subtle forms of care that sustain life. And that this has really unsettled for them familiar ideas of productivity, efficiency. So they've really come to sort of appreciate the complexity, the interdependencies in a garden between species, people, and many other things, as well as the uncertainties of this endeavor. And here they talk about knowledge is not extracted, but encountered. And I think that's a really important factor of gardening, where knowledge is not just handed over, it's not extracted, but it's really an embodied encounter with the garden through that close attention and really being out there in the elements, whether very hot in Arizona or very wet and windy in the UK. And I just want to give one more example. So we asked, a couple of weeks ago, I asked the students to read a text. It was a paper, an academic paper on rain pedagogies, how we might work with the rain with children and young people. And I asked them to discuss the text in a sort of typical way you might in an academic seminar. And then I asked them to choose particular lines and they discussed those. And then I invited them to write a poem based on, we're taking out words from from the lines that they had highlighted. And this is one group's poem. So it says, "Today my friend is coming. I saw it on the forecast. When that earthy smell reaches my nose, I know they are here. I need to converse with them, think through a poem." Um, and this poem, for me at least, really evokes that of Walt Whitman's The Voice of Rain. And in this, the speaker is having a conversation with rain, the speaker who's in a rain shower at the time. And then the rain goes on to describe its eternal cycle. And Whitman, in the last two lines of the poem, highlights that this is uh, a sort of metaphor, the poem and the rain talking is a metaphor for poetry itself. So the suggestion is that the creative expression is integral to people thinking in the same way as rain is integral to the survival of the planet and the globe. So rain, like poetry, he says, draws attention to that which we love and want to preserve in the world. And that the students here, co-authoring with rain, emphasizes their inseparability to their self-love and world love, how they're sort of both inherently interdependent. So this kind of meandering poetic pedagogy is slow, and it offers no certainty of what students will learn or take from the activity. But in those sort of poetic ventures, in their writing together of the poetry, they're really responding to the paper, the text that they've engaged with as an aspect of the world, but also their experience of gardening in the rain. They are very weathered, these students. They have experienced the rain a lot. So they're taking up that call to respond to the world with love in ways that is uniquely their own as well, and therefore inherently uncertain to the teaching endeavour. So lastly, I just wanted to highlight a resource, an educational resource that I've developed with colleagues at Sussex that offers it's 15 topics on environmental sustainability, including things like apples and forests, that sort of gives a whole range of activities that can be used to engage students with uncertainty. And we've got a set of films as well with teachers talking, and myself and others, and sort of examples of the work we've done with students. So I will stop there and stop sharing. And yes, so that is a sort of potted version of the sort of work we're doing in the UK, in the Southeast.
Amazing. Thank you, Perpetua. And for those of you viewing, we will put those links in the show notes so that if you were frantically trying to capture them, know that they'll be available below. Perpetua, we'll give you a minute to catch your breath, and I'd like to welcome to the webinar some of my colleagues, and I'll invite them to each introduce themselves briefly. And while they're doing that, and while Perpetua's catching her breath, we'll all be thinking of questions that we think are relevant for all of you out there across Arizona working with school gardens. And so without further ado, if we could introduce ourselves, and maybe Kelly, Sarah, and then Tyler.
Sure. Hi, I'm Kelly Hedberg. I'm the Garden Integration Specialist at Rover Elementary. It's a Title I pre-K through 5 school right here in Tempe, Arizona.
Hi there, Sarah Hipperson. I am the program manager for ASU Farm, and I will let Tyler introduce ASU Farm since he's the director.
Hi there, Tyler DeRoche here. I'm a faculty member at the School of Sustainability and also in philosophy. And I'm also the director of ASU Farm. ASU Farm is a new center at ASU, the Center for Environmental Stewardship and Character Building. And we have several focal virtues. We focus on adaptation, care, cooperation, environmental stewardship, environmental humility, and a strong work ethic.
Thanks, everyone. So Perpetua, I think that was an amazing presentation. And we were talking in the chat about current student number 9, whose reflection stunned us all, including the quiet labor of soil, which I wrote down. But I wonder if anyone wants to start with a question, or if I get to go first. Kelly, you look like you're ready. Oh, sorry, Sarah, please.
You go first, Kelly.
It's fine, Sarah, go ahead.
Well, I'm just curious. I have a little one. He's 5, and he's my only one. And so, your work explores, engaging uncertainty, climate change, all the tough subjects, biodiversity even. Um, so how might K through 12 educators introduce these complexities to the younger ones in a way that, supports curiosity and like the resilience instead of the fear and overwhelm that could also accompany the emotions that you spoke about? Or do we want them to feel the fear and the overwhelm and support them through that emotion?
Yeah, it's a really tough one. I mean, I'd say firstly, I think they already feel it. Um, you know, uh, I think well, research shows that young people and children are already, know of climate change and ecological degradation. They've known of sort of threats to species for, years and have been very invested in supporting campaigns to protect species. So I think that knowledge and fear is already there. Um, and I'm not, so I think we have to sort of provide that space for them to engage with it and surface it, but in ways that are manageable and doable for them. So not to sort of, we have to be like all teaching you sort of observe and scaffold what's appropriate for a given child or cohort. But I do think it is about enabling, opening up those spaces. So I've got a PhD student who's currently looking at grief and hope around climate education in primary school. So, and he's looking at ways, for example, to offer children close observation of the outdoors. So he's drawing on an idea from Japan where they have 72 seasons. I think it's 72. 70, maybe it's 42. I can't remember, but they have many seasons. So sort of every 3 or 4 days it shifts, and they have a different name for it. And it's about, and it reflects, and of course this will be changing with climate change, but it reflects sort of what happens in that season at a particular time, a particular flower buds and he's using that as an example to sort of really enable them that close attention to the outdoors, the shifts, the changes, and how that might be changing because of weather patterns, climate change. But it's really about fostering that deep attention and that capacity to stay with something, and to stay with it maybe a bit longer than they might initially want to, and using that as a means to sort of open up philosophical questions. Do plants care for each other? Do plants care for us? Do we, the children start to raise their own questions. And I think offering the opportunity for them to raise their own questions means you do start with where they're at, rather than, we can be really worried about overburdening them. So, and often early years education is often inherently uncertain. It's play-based, and it's imaginary play, and they go off and, play at dying and, all sorts. They're actually working these things through play, and then suddenly they get to a certain stage in education and we withdraw that and we start giving them lots of information, and we lose that capacity to open up those spaces where they can actually start imagining and dealing with their fears and imagining alternative possibilities as well. So it's how we do that, I think.
Great, thank you. I appreciate your answer.
I appreciate the challenge as well with a young child.
I have a question. So as K through 12 teachers, how can we incorporate nature as a co-teacher in our learning spaces? So a lot of times, in K through 12 in particular, like, Sarah asked a great question, and a lot of times, the conversations don't start with wonder, curiosity, and inquiry because they're laying the foundation of like, what is a plant? What is, what is water? They're laying the foundation of what these cycles and these spaces and these phenomena are. So how can we help teachers view nature really as a co-teacher and encourage them to really trust them as a co-teacher? So when they are teaching out in a space and they have uncertainty, they can't answer a question a child has, they don't know the name of something. These are moments that make teachers very uncomfortable when they can't answer a question. How do we move them to a space where they're really trusting that nature is going to answer that question for the children, if we just give them the permission, freedom, and independence to learn in those spaces, on their own terms?
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge for teachers and schools and educational institutions where we're so schooled in certainty.
Yep.
And mastery. That is the global acceptance mode of teaching and what education is for. So it's really challenging for individual teachers to do it. When we work with teachers, we're trying to support them to open very small spaces of doing this. The curriculum is usually really full. They've got a lot. They have to teach the water cycle. There's lots in the curriculum that they have to teach. So we sort of invite them to think if there's something a little bit they could open in that lesson on the water cycle, say. So a bit like I did with this text on the, water pedagogies and rain pedagogies, how we might bring rain into working with young children, was we gave serious attention to the paper and, the text. And then there was this moment of opening up this sort of creative possibility. And I think it's whether we can support teachers to just try out little bits to do that without, fear or favor. They're sort of without any expectation of what will come out. And in fact, the worse it goes, in some ways, the better, because, we'll learn a lot from that. And it means we have let go a bit,
Yeah. And I liked how you said, it was a conversation between the student and rain. And that's a simple way to really open up a huge opportunity for students to express, their thoughts, feelings, and emotions about rain, which is critical.
Yeah.
But like you said, that's such a simple way to open that door for a kiddo.
Exactly. It's just finding those little moments. And that's still really hard for teachers, and of course that is much better if the head of the school is sort of on board, and as a school they can support that work. It can be cross, different classes, and then it's a sharing, and the class can share and the teachers can share. That is obviously much, much more helpful. But for a teacher who's interested in it, quite often it is driven by teachers who are just passionate about this subject anyway. Perhaps they have the courage to just take a little bit of space to be playful themselves.
Yeah. Thank you.
To reimagine teaching.
Perpetua, I was struck by your statement about beyond learning, and I wonder what our learning scientist has to say about that. But we can ask Steve in just a moment, perhaps. But then you contrasted that with how engagement with the world is transformed. And I think this is precisely what we're trying to do with ASU Farm. Yes, it's about the cultivation of plants. Yes, it is about addressing food insecurity among students and growing vegetables and being productive. But it's also about the cultivation of character. And for a philosopher, a person's character, it's constituted by the virtues that they possess. And I mentioned earlier, the 6 virtues are focal virtues at ASU Farm. So I wondered, this is kind of core to who we are as ASU Farm, that we have these kind of focal virtues and these activities. It's also, yes, it's about learning. We're also, learning, but there are also these kind of deeper changes that are part of our intentions of what we're trying to accomplish. And I wonder whether you've thought along these lines. It sounds like we're perhaps using different concepts, different words, but we're attempting to achieve similar things.
Yeah. I mean, I think sort of the notion of character in the UK at least is quite tainted with a sort of empire building. It was the sort of the Boy Scouts. It was, that the Baden-Powell who started Boy Scouts at the turn of the 20th century was very much about character forming to be a good empire citizen. So it's got a sort of history that
I think that there is some discomfort here as well, depending on at ASU, people with different disciplines, different backgrounds, they're
yeah,
kind of uncomfortable with like virtue talk and character talk. But I think what I really like about it is supposedly, no matter who you are, you care about what a good person is. Then that runs across so many different religious traditions, so many different philosophical traditions. And yes, these are culturally, religiously situated in very different ways. But there's a common conversation. And that conversation is, what constitutes, a good person? Where do these characteristics, dispositions that contribute to human flourishing, where do they come from? They come from practices. To become a courageous person requires acting courageously over and over again in the right circumstances, and doing that over, and suddenly, becomes this kind of deeply entrenched disposition that one possesses, and you become a courageous person, for example.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And it is, yes. So what I'm talking about is very much opening that sort of possibility of an ethical engagement with the world. It's not, it keeps open what that is. So Bista even talks about in one provocative paper that it might mean you shoot someone, because it might be that that's what is demanded by the situation,
Self-defense or something.
self-defense, for example, so that's not very kind, it's sort of, but so it keeps open what that might look like. But what it's really focusing on is that attention to the ethical context of this moment right here, right now. What does it require of me? Rather than what do I want? So it shifts that focus, exactly in the way that you're talking about, but it doesn't presume to know what that will look like in any given context. And that's the sort of uniqueness of the response of the student or person in the world, because it's so dependent on the situation. But absolutely, it's very aligned. And, it's fantastic the work you're doing at ASU on that, and that shift beyond just knowing things about plants and agriculture, etc. All of which is really important that our students know too.
Yeah. And I'm sure you've probably had countless experiences where students are just confronted with an entirely new circumstance, and you see the transformation before your eyes. Like, wow, it is fun to be having my hands in dirt, or in soil, and like, just these experiences that they're unacquainted with. And suddenly it just clicks, and something had been missing and they were unaware of that thing missing. And then they've received it and they know what to do somehow.
Absolutely. And it is as Kelly was saying, it is nature doing that. It is something about the sort of the coming together of that encounter with something that's very different, but also often inherently joyful, that coming together that sort of is energizing and sort of calls students to really want to do something. It's very powerful.
Yeah, thank you.
I think it's also more powerful when the individual drives the connection as opposed to it being driven by a lesson plan, a space, a directive or a standard, as we like to talk about. But when these kids, when these 4 and 5, 8, 9, 10-year-olds, when they are being given the permission to choose how they're going to connect emotionally to nature, that's when stewardship begins, right? Because now they care. Now they have empathy, and it's different for every kid, right? For some, this morning it was all about the roly-polies because they were out, and but for some kids it's just it's quiet, and classrooms are not quiet. So it might be about the sound, or it might be about something they've eaten. It might be a memory of a family member that has a similar plant in their yard. So the beauty is just the opportunities are just endless for these emotional connections if we just give students, I say it all the time, the permission and freedom to really make these connections on their own.
Yeah, I think you've sort of outlined it really beautifully. And that's why sort of engaging in different kinds of activities is so important to tap
Which is
into
good
what might be
news,
there.
right? That's good news. That means you can do it with math, with English, with biology, with art, with music. There's no limit to how you connect it academically. So there's so many positives in terms of how to frame these experiences.
Absolutely.
Perpetua, I wanted to ask you a question, but I want to weigh in on Tyler's provocation as well. And this idea of beyond learning, I think to me is all about the boats. And that idea I love the metaphor. And that idea of not knowing, I think is really important because in this country, we are largely driven by this outcome. Like we want to get on that plane, we want to get on that train and get to our destination. We're going to exchange that knowledge to get a grade, to get a diploma, and to move on to what's next. And I think part of what's really powerful about the boat metaphor and the not knowing is that idea that we are submitting, in a sense, to the world. It's not that we're just trying to acquire information, but we're open to that with curiosity and wonder, like you were saying, Kelly, and kind of being open to what comes our way, whatever emerges in that encounter. And I think that's really powerful because if we are looking beyond learning what's there, I think it's a way of being in the world. And that world centeredness, I think, is a really powerful metaphor for teachers to think with, especially during those uncomfortable moments when we're trying to land on the content. What's the standard that this question I can't answer needs to get to? And maybe it doesn't need to get there, right? And so for me, that's a struggle as an educational researcher. And I hear that in the initial question that Kelly posed to you as well, Perpetua. And this will get to a question in a second, but I wanted to plug this other thing. I was a teacher, a researcher in Singapore, which next to Shanghai is an education system that constantly is at the heights of test performance globally. And one of my colleagues there wrote a paper called Guerrilla Constructivism, not the animal, but the war tactic. And he felt that what teachers really needed to do was to find those openings where they could create opportunities for curiosity, wonder, submission to these world-centered spaces. And I think those are ones where we can create with uncertainty. And I think that's a really interesting and compelling way to get on that boat and pursue the horizons beyond learning. My question to you, though, is thinking with Arizona educators, I wonder about the systems you've been navigating with teachers, school leaders, policymakers in the UK. How do educators and students respond to uncertainty in the learning environments that you've been working in?
Well, if I start with the teachers, for the teachers in the way that Kelly highlighted, this is a real challenge for them in the ways we discussed before, because the system is structured exactly the way you've described it, for Arizona and the US. And I think that is global. We have sort of global league tables of our education systems, and they put a lot of downward pressure to ensure we're all really keeping in the plane. And we have teachers going to Singapore from the UK to learn about, how they're teaching math and that kind of thing. So, and the curriculum is really packed full. We have a national curriculum, so every child, unless they're privately educated, is doing the same curriculum across the UK. And they are tested at different stages with national tests. In primary school and in secondary school and in college, our sixth form college. So there is a lot of pressure on teachers to keep it very certain. So, there's not going to be a revolution in education anytime soon. And we talk about this as sort of not a major revolution. It's a minor revolution because it's about creating those spaces. It's about keeping the boat, the plane, and the train within the classroom. It's why would you give up the plane? I've just done it now, in the 15 minutes of talking, that was the plane. So it's useful. TED Talks are the plane, YouTube videos on how to mend your bike is the plane. It's a really useful educational tool, but it's become so dominant and then the train, and there's tensions always between the plane and the train, and over time education shifts to one or the other, but it's still ultimately about learning and getting to a particular destination. So I suppose the mini revolution is just to create those mini spaces of the boat. And that perhaps is less threatening than a huge overhaul of the system, as Kelly said in the chat. Balance, yeah, it's sort of exactly finding that balance. So it is a struggle working with teachers. So we found working with teachers in Wales, where they have a different curriculum and it's slightly looser, there were much more possibilities than teachers in England to really embed this and sustain it. Teachers are keen. So there's a teacher I worked with a few years ago, and we did a project, but sort of me and my colleague Rebecca in the classroom with the teacher, and we did a whole project on water over several weeks, and we couldn't really embed sort of uncertainty there. But over time, she's just sort of not been able to do it, and now she's keen to come back to it and find another way through her orchard. But you can see the struggle she's up against. So this is someone really keen, but she's under so much pressure to deliver. So I feel that actually as universities, we have a really important role to showcase and advocate why this type of education matters, because we have much greater freedom with our curricula and our pedagogies. So I think it's sort of beholden to us to sort of experiment, explore, and showcase that with schools, and why we think it matters, and actually why we think it matters for students coming into education at the higher education level, what it is we're looking for, why that's of an asset to a student to be able to work with uncertainty for coming into the higher education pathway. I don't know if I've totally answered your question, but
I appreciate your answer, because yes, you've talked about educators, but again, reminded institutions like Sussex and Arizona State that we have a very privileged position and therefore a responsibility to contribute more meaningfully than we already are. So I think that's important. We are about out of time. I wonder if there's any final questions anyone wants to pose to Perpetua before we wrap up. And while people are thinking, audience members, we wish we could have invited you to the table as well. But you can reach out to us with any questions you have as well, and I'll provide some contact information in the show notes as well.
And people are very welcome to email me too. So if you would like to share my email, I'd be very happy.
Thank you. Okay.
Well, I think
please.
it's a wonderful presentation, Perpetua. I really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for sharing, and I hope you continue to take risks and use it as a growth model for all of education in this area. We need it.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks very much. I will keep trying.
And that's a nice way to wrap up. I'm going to close with some high production value thank yous, foremost to Perpetua, and I'll come back to you in a second. But a shout out to ASU Farm. Thank you so much for supporting this effort. And we invite all of you viewers to check out ASU Farm at the website, which is again in the show notes, but farm.asu.edu. Also, a thank you to Kelly Hedberg and the Rover Vine. And if you are not already following them, check out their Facebook group. These pictures I stole from there today, and it is an amazing storytelling experience to follow Rover Vine and all of the opportunities that are unfolding there. Thanks for joining us, Kelly. Also, a thank you to the Arizona Farm to School Network, as well as the Blue Water Mountain Project, who are distributing this webinar more broadly across Arizona. And finally, thank you, Perpetua, and to the University of Sussex. And as a close, I just want to highlight that this was not always the University of Sussex's fancy display icon. And you'll see here that they do have a coat of arms. And I thought it was a nice resonance with your talk, Perpetua, that at the bottom you can all see "Be still and know" is part of that longstanding coat of arms for the university. And I think that's a nice message for us all to consider as we go out to the gardens with our students. So with that, thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to offering more webinars in the future. Thanks again.